April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The United States military launched Operation Iceberg, deploying the largest naval armada since D-Day to assault a slender 60-mile-long island in the Pacific. This was Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the invasion of the Japanese mainland. For days, American battleships had pulverized the island with relentless artillery, attempting to soften the defenses. As the landing craft ramped down, 200,000 U.S. infantrymen and Marines braced for an absolute slaughter. They expected the beaches to be a meat grinder, a repeat of the bloody, heavily contested landings of Tarawa or Iwo Jima. But as the first wave hit the sand, they were greeted by something completely terrifying. Silence. There were no machine gun nests, no pre-sighted mortar rounds raining down, no screaming enemy charges. The troops stood on the beach in complete, eerie silence. Some soldiers genuinely thought the Navy had dropped them on the wrong island. Where was the enemy? They didn't know it yet, but they had just walked into the most perfectly executed, mathematically brutal trap in the history of the Pacific War. This wasn't a mistake. The Imperial Japanese Army was waiting for them, and the next 82 days would shatter the minds and bodies of the men trapped inside the Typhoon of Steel. The Americans referred to the D-Day of Okinawa as Love Day. For the first 48 hours, it felt like a bizarre vacation. The troops effortlessly sliced the island in half. The Army pivoted south, while the Marines headed north. In the north, the Marines encountered rugged, mountainous terrain, but relatively light resistance. They secured their objectives with shocking speed. But down in the south, the bulk of the U.S. Army was marching into a nightmare. The Japanese had fundamentally changed their strategy. The commanding officer, General Mitsuru Ushijima, knew he could not defeat the American fleet, and he knew he could not win the battle. His objective was not victory, it was attrition. He wanted to make the Americans bleed so profusely that they would reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. To do this, Ushijima abandoned the beaches entirely. He knew American naval guns would obliterate any coastal defenses. Instead, he pulled his entire army of over 100,000 men underground into the jagged limestone ridges and mountains of the southern sector. The U.S. troops were about to face the ultimate tactical nightmare: the reverse slope defense. When American troops attacked a hill like the infamous Sugarloaf Hill or Hacksaw Ridge, they would fight their way up the front side, taking heavy fire. But the real horror began when they reached the top. The Japanese had fortified the backside of the hills. As soon as the Americans crested the ridge, they were completely exposed to perfectly sighted machine guns, mortars, and artillery firing from interconnected subterranean cave networks on the opposite slope. When the Americans inevitably called in artillery to bombard the Japanese positions, the Japanese soldiers simply retreated deep into their bomb-proof tunnel systems, waited for the shelling to stop, and then returned to their guns. Every hill was a fortress. Every cave had a fallback position. To take a single yard of ground, American soldiers had to physically burn or blast the defenders out of the rock, one cave at a time. The Japanese called the battle Tetsu no Ame, the Typhoon of Steel. The sheer volume of artillery fired by both sides was unprecedented in human history. But the horror wasn't just on land. Out at sea, the U.S. Navy was enduring its own apocalypse. Knowing the American fleet was anchored off the coast to support the ground troops, the Japanese unleashed the Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. It was the largest concentrated suicide attack in naval history. Swarms of Japanese aircraft loaded with high explosives deliberately rammed themselves into American ships. The Navy, tethered to the island to provide artillery support, couldn't flee. They became known as the Navy who came to stay. The kamikaze strikes were devastatingly effective. 36 American ships were completely sunk, and another 368 were severely damaged. Over 6,000 U.S. sailors were killed, the largest loss of life in the history of the U.S. Navy in a single battle. Back on land, the conditions for the frontline infantrymen deteriorated into an absolute hellscape that defied human comprehension. The war in the Pacific was fundamentally different from the European theater. In France, American GIs might liberate a village, be greeted with cheers, share a bottle of wine, and sleep in a dry barn. In the Pacific, the environment itself was trying to kill you. And then, the monsoon rains came. The battlefields of Okinawa turned into a churning ocean of deep, sucking mud. Tanks sank and became useless. Jeeps couldn't move. If a soldier was wounded, he had to be manually carried for miles through mud so thick it would physically suck the boots off a man's feet. Soldiers were forced to live, sleep, and fight in foxholes filled with freezing water and their own waste. But the worst part was the dead. The sheer density of the combat meant that bodies could not be recovered. The stench of decomposing corpses hung over the island like a physical weight. The horror reached a point of macabre absurdity. If a soldier needed to dig a new foxhole to survive an artillery barrage, he would often find himself shoveling directly through the maggot-infested remains of a dead Japanese soldier that someone else had hastily buried days prior. Flies swarmed by the millions. Disease ran rampant. Under these conditions, the human mind simply began to fracture. The psychological toll was so severe that men lost their humanity. The brutality of the enemy, combined with the grotesque living conditions, drove some soldiers to extreme dark behaviors, collecting ears, pulling gold teeth from the dead, or desecrating corpses. When the officers saw men breaking this way, they were rapidly pulled off the line. It was not an uncommon sight. The line between man and animal blurred in the mud of Okinawa. By the time the island was finally declared secure on June 22, 1945, the cost was staggering. The Battle of Okinawa remains an absolute outlier in the history of warfare. It is the only battle in World War II where the commanding generals of both armies were killed in action. U.S. General Simon Bolivar Buckner was killed by enemy artillery fire just days before the battle ended, and Japanese General Ushijima committed ritual suicide before he could be captured. The human toll was apocalyptic. Over 12,000 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines were dead, 6,000 more than the bloodbath at Iwo Jima. The Japanese military suffered over 100,000 dead, and tragically, over 100,000 Okinawan civilians, nearly half the island's pre-war population, perished in the crossfire or were forced into mass suicide by Japanese propaganda. There was no glorious, happy ending for the survivors of the Typhoon of Steel. When the guns finally fell silent, the exhausted, traumatized American soldiers were not sent home to a ticker tape parade. Because of the complex geopolitical fallout of the war's end, many of these shattered men were immediately loaded onto ships and sent to China as an occupation force. The U.S. High Command knew what these men had endured. They knew the battle had stripped away their youth, and in some cases, their sanity. The battle simply ended. It just was. And the survivors had to carry the ghosts of the mud, the rain, and the silence with them for the rest of their lives. If the brutal, unfiltered reality of the Pacific War changed how you view military history, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that the gritty, unpolished stories of the frontline soldier deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the archives. What do you think? Was the invasion of Okinawa the ultimate proof that an invasion of mainland Japan would have been too costly? Let us know in the comments below.